Hello friends, and welcome back to Dungeon Design in Zelda. Last time, we completed the Thieves' Town dungeon and got ourselves the Titan's Mitt. While that item had no real utility within the actual dungeon itself, it is required to enter this dungeon, making the Ice Palace a logical follow-up in terms of dungeon order. To elaborate, the Ice Palace is located at the center of the Dark World's Lake Hylia equivalent, but is surrounded by high walls on all sides, making entrance from the exterior impossible. Instead, we need to enter from the light world by heading to this small island in the center of Lake Hylia and using the Titan's Mitt to lift this dark heavy stone and uncover this portal. Simple enough and good use of the game's dual world system. I love it when we have to use one world to enter the dungeon of another. Worth another mention as well, just as I advised about Skull Woods, I highly recommend upgrading your magic meter if you haven't already. This dungeon will be pretty reliant on using magic, and while magic drops are pretty plentiful here, the upgraded magic meter helps a lot. And hey, while we're at it, you may as well upgrade the Master Sword too before heading over, which we can do now that we have that aforementioned Titan's Mitt. Tempering the blade doubles its damage output, so it is absolutely worthwhile to do, though again, not mandatory. Alright, with all of that said, once we've uncovered this portal and returned to the Dark World, we can head right on into the dungeon. There aren't many dungeons in the Legend of Zelda series that I would rate negatively, especially from A Link to the Past onwards. In fact, there's only one dungeon in A Link to the Past that I would say I actually dislike, and that is the Ice Palace. I have a long list of grievances that I've held against this dungeon for decades, but I promise that I really tried going into this dungeon with an open mind during this playthrough. That said, the Ice Palace seems to fall short in a lot of ways that other dungeons in this game excel. It feels like someone took my long list of gripes and nitpicks that I've had about nearly every other dungeon, cranked all of those issues up to 11, then threw it into one of the game's longest slogs of a dungeon, and then threw in slippery ice physics to top it all off. I'd like to reiterate before anyone comments skill issue that I do not have an issue with games being difficult, so long as that difficulty feels fair and earned. My favorite game last year was Tunic. I streamed and completed Metroid Dread on Dread mode and completed it 100%. Twice. I even spoke very positively about Zelda 2 in this video, and the Water Temple is one of my top 3 dungeons in Ocarina of Time. Being challenged here is not the issue. In fact, challenge can make victory feel all the more rewarding. What I dislike is how this dungeon feels like it is constantly wasting my time. I keep feeling punished for exploring thoroughly, and to make matters worse, I never quite feel like I'm having that moment of payoff. Let's elaborate. The dungeon starts off fine enough. You'll encounter some ice enemies inside right near this stone tablet that hints towards using the fire rod. Then you'll be strung along around the dungeon from room to room in what is essentially a combat gauntlet. There are very few branching paths, and those few moments where they do branch out, you'll usually be greeted by dead ends, save for the critical path that they want you to follow. There's no central room to speak of that the dungeon branches off from, just a lengthy linear series of challenges, and that would be fine, honestly. I have nothing against linearity in my dungeons, and considering the last dungeon was so large, open, and exploration heavy, having a linear gauntlet style dungeon is not a bad thing. Heck, Ocarina of Time's Fire and Shadow Temples are both rigidly linear dungeons that I have praised as well. It's just that the execution here for the Ice Palace isn't quite there for me, and there are a few few reasons why. Like Ocarina of Time's Fire Temple, the Ice Palace is essentially a giant loop. This worked for the Fire Temple because the loop takes you up to the heights of the dungeon, culminating in a mid-boss fight that rewards you with a useful item. Then it drops you back here for a minor detour where we use that item to get the boss key and then confront the dungeon boss. It feels like a natural sequence of events with a very little backtracking. The Ice Palace, however, instead chooses to make you do a lap through the dungeon, teasing you with dead ends and the big chest, rewarding you with the big key at the end of the lap. However, where the Fire Temple's loop comes to a close at the boss, which was right near the entrance, the boss of the Ice Palace is at the very bottom of the dungeon, down in basement 7. So the loop comes to a close at the opposite end of the dungeon, meaning essentially we have to take a second lap and clean up whatever goodies we couldn't get on our first go through. And why is the dungeon map way down here near where that loop comes to a close, whereas the compass is here right near the start of the dungeon? It always feels weird for me and kind of illegal to get the compass before the map. Personally, I would have simply swapped these, because at this point when we get the map, we've now explored almost the entire dungeon, whereas when we get the compass much earlier on, which only marks the boss location on the map for us in this game, we have no real context for how far away that actually is because it's marking an icon on an empty space several floors away. I'd rather get the map sooner, explore the dungeon at length, and then get the compass near the end of that exploration, spurring us to head down on towards the boss. That makes more sense to me in terms of progression. The second lap I mentioned could be more forgivable if there were more satisfying payoffs offered by this pass through the dungeon as well. Like, if the dungeon item changed or simplified the way we made our way through here, say if there were shortcuts we could now use thanks to a new ability, or enemies made more easy to dispatch or bypass. You know, things that Zelda dungeons typically do. Think of the way the hookshot fundamentally changes your approach to pretty well any obstacle in places like the Swamp Palace, or even better yet, the Lakebed Temple, where it opens up shortcuts and paths around the central room. However, the dungeon item here is the blue mail. This doubles your defense, which is fine. It's quite worthwhile actually. However, I don't feel like it should have been placed in a dungeon like this one, because it doesn't really enhance the dungeon experience. It always struck me like they were running out of item ideas, so they stuck in an incremental upgrade to your stats for a second dungeon in a row. Again, I could forgive this if we didn't have to make a second pass through nearly the entire dungeon. If this place were simply structured differently with, let's say, a memorable central room and a scattered batch of keys and locked doors, then this would probably not bother me. I just don't find it fun to go through here again, fight the same enemies, solve the same puzzles, and unlock the same doors in exactly the same way that I just did 10 minutes ago, all while enduring the slippery, freaking ice physics. I mentioned before that there were very few deviations or splits in the road, and there are a few gripes I have with these. I like the concept of gating rooms like this where you have to push a block to open the path, but that blocks off the other path, so you have to work around that. That's a cool concept, but it is usually meaningless because the room immediately resets when you walk out the door and walk back in. I'm sure people will tell me that this is a hardware limitation, but I can promise you it's really not. There are dungeons in the Oracle games, which ran on inferior hardware, that do this very concept better, with rotating platforms that don't reset like this, and it makes navigation way more interesting. And there is a puzzle in this very dungeon itself that also does not immediately reset, but we'll come back to that puzzle in a moment. Here though, you just push the block, walk a few feet, and then turn around and push the block again. It's more like an obstacle masquerading as a puzzle, so it feels like there was some missed potential there. And let's not forget the trap room where the door seals behind you and the floor starts crumbling beneath you. Why do we keep doing this? I have already complained about this idea at length in several previous videos, but rooms like this really run counter to what Zelda is all about for me. You should not be penalizing your players for exploring thoroughly. Exploration is at the heart of the series. It's something you want to always be rewarding and encouraging. Alas, that's not what they do here. All of this progression through the dungeon culminates in one final puzzle. In short, we have these red-blue gem switches, which I am usually very fond of, and we need to push one of these blocks, specifically this one, down this hole to the room below, so that we can use it to hold down this floor switch and open the door. Sounds simple enough, and conceptually, I like this. On paper, it sounds great. A multi-floored puzzle that uses alternating elements that we've learned in previous dungeons and combines that with a push block puzzle. This should have been awesome. However, the block can only be pushed a single space on the game's invisible grid before it locks in place for some reason. And because of the way the game's sprite work is done here, we can't get a sense of the space of the floor below from up here before we push the block down, meaning we just have to guess at which one to push. Odds are, on a first playthrough, you are not going to know that this is the right one over here. You just have to take a stab at it and hope for the best. And if you mess this up, you can't just reset the puzzle. And because of the gem switch and barrier placement, the correct one is blocked off. So in order to do this properly, you have to go the long way around and take a third lap through the dungeon. And if you don't have a great sense of direction, you could take a wrong turn at one of those very samey looking cross-shaped splits in the road and end up even more off course. So what could have been a very fun multi-room puzzle ends up being a serious chore. But once that headache is out of the way, we can finally descend down to the boss fight. Dropping down into the arena, we'll be confronted by Cold Stare with a K. He's a giant eyeball, but cold. He's frozen, he's so chilly. Okay, so there's a lot of bosses in this game. Some of them are really fun, and some of them are Cold Stare. From a visual standpoint, yeah, he is a giant eyeball. If you've been keeping up with this series, you already know how I feel about that. As far as combat goes, this guy is more like a stress ball than a dungeon boss. You can use your fire rod to blast through his ice shell, and then you just go to town pummeling him after that. He'll split into three and launch these little ice cubes at you. How cute. But these are not hard to avoid. He is a total pushover. I really don't have much to say about this fight. He's incredibly easy to overpower at this point, and not even in a way where it's super fun or just a cool spectacle. Oh wait, I just got that cool spectacle because he's Cold Stare. Yeah. Anyways, basically you just beat him senseless. Poor guy never stood a chance. He's not as fast as, say, Blind the Thief. Things don't get chaotic or bullet hellish like Mothula. This is just a cakewalk of a fight that is disappointingly easy compared to the way that the difficulty curve has been moving. Oh well. Once he's defeated, we'll get our heart container as usual, the maiden is freed, exposition, and we're off to explore the Dark World some more. But more fashionably now, I suppose. So that's the dungeon. I don't like complaining this much for this long, so I'm going to try to say some good things about this place. Here goes. Some of the combat in this dungeon is really satisfying to do. These guys, called Freezors, are a genuine pleasure to melt into nothingness. And if you've got the Ether Medallion, you can freeze entire groups of these Pengators and obliterate them all with your hammer. They'll usually give magic drops too, so it isn't particularly costly to do so either. And it's just so fun. The Stalfos Knight enemies are also pretty cool. It's nice to see them show up even though they go down super easily. There are also some fun spots to use the hook shot, and I like the blue mail, despite my complaints about it earlier. It feels incongruent with the level design, but the item itself is good. This is my favorite look for Link in the game, and I will always welcome a defense boost. Overall, it is nice that they tried to go for a more linear and challenge-heavy dungeon to follow up one of the game's more open and exploration-heavy dungeons. I see what they were going for, but the execution feels like fumble after fumble. If those design elements didn't frustrate me enough, they had to top it all off with ice physics. Who doesn't love slippery ice physics? Me. I don't love slippery ice physics, not unless they're paired with a really fun sliding block puzzle. So overall, this is my least favorite dungeon in the game. It is the only one that I actively dislike, and I can't even begin to offer suggestions on improving things like I did in the Thieves Town dungeon, because this one would need to basically be redesigned from the ground up. And this video can only go on for so long. I don't have all day. There isn't another dungeon in Zelda quite like this one. And that feels to me like it's because they learned from the massive missteps taken here. So yeah, I was kind of hoping that taking a critical approach like this would change my mind. But no, I still simply do not like this dungeon. Thank you all so much for watching, and an extra big thanks goes to my supporters across both Patreon and here on YouTube as a channel member. So thank you to Greymage, Brenda, Tetra, Hylian Wes, Justin, Midnight Naomi, and Bunny, as well as so many more people, the names of which you're seeing on screen here. Thank you all so much for all of the support. Thank you for watching, and I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day. Bye-bye.